What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to another episode of the Struggle to Strength podcast, your source for real life application on how to turn your struggles into strengths in all things mind, muscle, and money. When I saw that you were booked for like this episode, Travis reached out to me. He was like, yo, we got this guy Brian on. And like, he's going to teach us how to like beat our anxiety into submission, basically. And I was like, oh my God, thank God, man. I cannot wait. Cause I mean, like we didn't really talk about our anxiety previously. Like when we were in college and shit, we just thought it was always like the Sunday scaries.
I didn't get anxiety until like
really
the end of college. Yeah. Which is crazy because my anxiety is so bad now.
Me
but
too.
I didn't experience anxiety the way I know it now until my like early 20s. Yeah, I mean, or maybe like my junior or senior year of college is when I started to get anxiety. Mm-hmm. And I really like, I'd heard about it and I was like, yeah, I guess I get anxiety. And then now knowing what I know now, I was like, yeah, I never had anxiety until like when I was like a teenager and stuff. I don't know why, if I just had so much testosterone in my system that that I just didn't give a fuck about anything.
Can confirm. I don't know if that makes a huge difference. It did for me, to be honest. Yeah. It did for me when I went on TRT. It definitely made a difference. But I think you and I were pretty similar in that, like, I kind of felt the same way. I definitely was more aware of my anxiety, but I think as I entered adulthood and the more I understand, the more I work on this, the more I do my shadow work, the more I'm like realizing that I am in my own head. So when I saw the title of your books, Brian, I was like, okay, that's me. This guy has something I need to hear.
Cool. Yeah. And I mean, I think everybody is in their own head to some degree, or at least a lot of us are, right? And the difficult thing about it is that American culture and work-life culture and whatnot is so much revolved around now technology and analytics and whatnot, where we have kind of been told that for either directly or indirectly that we can solve a lot of things through critical thinking, right? And anxiety is just one of those things that it doesn't fit that bill, where you almost have to turn it around entirely. And a lot of folks will say like, oh, exercise is really helpful for me. And it's a phenomenal strategy. I mean, I tell folks that I basically exercise just for like 99% of the reason I exercise is for the mental health benefit at this point in my life, maybe 1% for the physical. And it's just because, or the reason it's so effective is like, it's one of the only things you do where you are so far out of your head, right? If you're running 3 miles, if you're trying to lift a heavy weight, like there is no time and no room for you to be analytical. And that's kind of a beautiful thing. It's something that we don't really get in that many areas of our lives anymore.
Yeah. And I was actually having a conversation, I think with my mother, who's a therapist, and we talk about this shit all the time. I was like, I think that's part of why I like lifting really heavy. You know, my parents don't love that I lift as heavy as I do, or that like my fitness is as almost consuming at times as it is. But I'm a bodybuilder; it's part of the sport. But dude, it's hard to be in your own head and not laser focused on what you're doing when you have 400 pounds on your back. Like it works very effectively. Now, Did I use exercise as a way to like bury some of my emotions in the past? And like, did I have an unhealthy relationship with it? Of course. But it is one of the things that most consistently helps me. Like exercise and snowboarding are one of the things that most consistently help me. So like I have outlets, I have passions, but there's still times when I'm not doing those things that I'm in my head. So I'm really curious to learn more about what you do and how you've been able to improve where you have been. So I guess the first thing that I think would be really helpful is like, tell us a little bit about you, where you came from and how you got here. Like what made you want to do this?
Yeah, it's a funny story just in the sense of like most people will ask me that question and basically say, hey, I know your background. Why are you doing this stuff? It doesn't make any sense. So just sort of the, going through life, going from high school, college, graduating college and whatnot, like we were talking about a couple minutes ago, just when we were teenagers, we didn't know if we had anxiety or whatever it may be, right? It was like, as I got older, I knew I was like a nervous person most of my life, but you don't really know what you're dealing with right away. And sometimes as you get older, you get into different situations where it's like, okay, what is there really to be nervous about when you're in fifth grade besides like, oh yeah, I mean, I don't want to get bullied. I don't want kids to pick on me or whatever. But, you get older, it's like you have these different responsibilities. Maybe you go on dates with women, or you have a job that it's a competitive environment and you're afraid of, if it's a sales job or something like that, like if you don't meet quota, like then you won't be able to put food on the table. You might get fired. So there's, things, I guess, become maybe a little bit matters of more importance as you get older and you start to identify with them and you say, oh, well, now I have certain things that I could lose, right? Whereas before it was like I lived at home, I had this safety net, whatever. But as I got older, it was kind of, the anxiety really started to emerge late in high school and then into college when I started dating, or at the very least, like hanging out with different women. And again, I always kind of knew that I was a nervous person, but that's what I would label it as. I would say it's like, oh, okay, I'm going on a date. I'm nervous. I have a track meet. I'm nervous. I didn't know that it was anxiety. And one of the reasons for that is like, and this is just a matter of fact, it's not casting opinion or anything, but it's like my family is not, none of us are doctors. None of us come from a clinical background or anything like that. So also this being the timeline that I'm going over, probably starting in like 2006, 2007, where it's like, Google existed, but in a very nascent form. So it wasn't like you have all these blogs, you have all these journal articles that are easy to find. You have all these books and self-published books and all these resources, right? So it was, even though today you need to know what words to look up in order to find certain solutions online, back then it was even more important, right? So I would type in like nervous or something, and then I don't know, you would find some random, like it wasn't even WordPress, some earlier platform than that, just some random HTML website, and somebody's like talking about their experiences or whatever. So it was very early days, a lot of ebooks and stuff, like early ebooks, or like basically PDFs that people sold.
Like the website version of like an ancient scroll type of thing.
Pretty much. Yeah. Very old school.
You have to read it by candlelight.
Yeah. And you're paying like $40 for somebody's like PDF that you have no idea who the person is, whatever. So anyway, going through college and whatnot, it was like starting to date different women. There was actually a story that I talk about in the beginning of my first book that I mentioned on pretty much every podcast appearance that I'm on, which was, I guess I would call it my second, like really significant moment with anxiety was, I had been seeing her a little bit. We were hanging out, and it was one of those things where it was like every time we hung out, or the handful of times that we hung out, we had been drinking. And then one night she had texted me and I wasn't drinking. This is first, second week of college or whatever it is. And I could tell that she was via her text messages, just, kind of stumbling over words, and nothing makes like total sense. But it was just, you're 18, like you got what was that thing called, T9 or whatever on your phone, where you don't even have a full keyboard.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it wasn't, it wasn't like she was incoherent. It was just like she was drunk, right? And so I'm nervous. I'm like, again, using this word, I didn't know that it was anxiety or whatever, but I'm just like, I like this girl. She's coming over. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm sober. I don't have a ton of experience in this realm. Like, I mean, a little bit, but it's just like in high school, we would drink and we would hang out with girls, and that kind of became a crutch, where it was like, if we're hanging out with women, like we can drink and we can have all this fun. But like, I didn't really do this inner work to know who I was, especially if I was sober. I wasn't as comfortable. Definitely have a little bit of social anxiety. Looking back, I can say that, but at the time I didn't really, I wasn't able to put those words on it. And so she came over, and, long story short was, she sits down next to me, and my heart is racing. Like, I'm basically in the middle of a panic attack, and I don't really know it at the time, but I'm just like, this is brutal. Like, I'm freaking out. Like, my mind is moving a million miles a minute. My heart is racing. My palms are sweating. She sits down next to me, and I'm kind of like, I hope this goes okay, but I don't really know. Like, I'm very, very nervous right now. And as soon as she sits down, she just like, she can tell that my heart is racing, almost like shaking a little bit. And she just like, drop of a dime, just turned and was like, yelling all these different obscenities at me, like, you freak, like, swear words and whatnot. And I'm not, it's not something that I like, I don't hold any grudge against her. Like, we were friendly throughout the rest of college, but it was definitely a difficult experience to go through, right? Where you're like, oh, this girl's coming over that like, I think maybe I could start a relationship with. And 2 minutes later, she's running down the hallway being like, never talk to me again, swear words, whatever. And so that really stuck with me, right? Where it was like, I woke up the next day and I was like, I know I need to do something about this. Like, whatever I've been calling this before, where I get nervous around like going out on dates or hanging out with different girls, like, I need to figure out what this is. And I need to start this journey. Obviously, when you're 18, you're kind of hoping that you can take a magic pill, or, you know, you can say one thing to yourself and you'll be cured overnight or whatever. But as I went along, you do realize it's kind of a journey. And I was listening to one of your guys' podcasts earlier, and Josh, you were saying like, you know, even though we have all these different healing modalities out in the world, it's like mental health still comes down to the thought processes that you run. And if you don't change those, it kind of doesn't matter what else you do. Right. Mm-hmm. And so that can be a really long haul, because a lot of those thought processes, like those, we've been running those things for a long, long time. And so, you know, the scientific community will say neurons that fire together wire together. And when we fire those neurons for a long, long time, all of a sudden we're 19 years old and those paths are really, you know, worn in or whatever. And so that was just kind of, you know, waking up that next day, that was really almost like my coming to moment. If there was a movie, like it would start with me at my computer the next day being like, WTF, like where do I go now? What do I do? Right. And I was also, to be totally honest, like I was humiliated, right? It was like, okay, here I am. Like, I'm thinking this might work out with this girl. And like, I wake up the next morning, I'm like, for all I know, like she thinks I'm a total freak, is telling all her friends, like nobody's ever going to hang out with me again or whatever. Yeah. And it didn't end up being that bad, but the experience itself was a real shocker for sure.
Mm-hmm. She probably had terrible anxiety the next day because she was drunk and was a total asshole to you.
Yeah, probably.
And she probably had horrible anxiety the next morning.
Yeah.
Like, whether she like said it or not, she was probably woke up and was like, oh God.
Yeah. And as someone with anxiety, like, yeah, you wake up the next day and like you get those distortions, those like cognitive distortions that are like, they go over and over and over. And then they kind of like put themselves into a blender and it becomes like a million different things that just run through your head and just gets worse and worse and worse. And like you said, those are frameworks. Like those are thoughts that you've been connecting in the past. That's like a system almost. And one of the things that I think you've noted on is like, there's almost like similarities between like in like computing of the human mind, where like we create connections, or our anxiety creates connections. And that those are like frameworks and systems that we have to break. And if you've been doing that for a long time, like some of these things I'm learning now in therapy, like I've been doing this shit for 15 years, dude. Like since I was 15, I've had this one thought process that's been getting in the way over and over and over again. And I've just learned about it. I'm like, well, shit, now I have to undo something I've been doing for 15 years subconsciously. So it's almost sound like there's actually similarities, like you're from software development, like there's similarities between like computing and the human brain in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And that is, so when I kind of said earlier that I tell folks that, you know, they'll know what my background is, and then they'll be like, why are you doing this mental health stuff? It kind of doesn't make sense, whatever. So as my full-time job, I'm a software developer. And so because I can't bring in the clinical side of things, because I'm not a therapist, social worker or anything like that, I have to bring my own unique approach to the subject. And so my part of my brand is talking about how does software development relate to mental health? How does the mind in a computer system, how do those two things relate to one another? And so there are a bunch of there's a lot of overlap, but sometimes I have to like, you know, kind of force the issue a little bit and be like, okay, these two things they seem unrelated, but let's make them related or whatever. And so just to give a concrete example, there's a concept in computer programming called recursion. And I mean, that term also exists, or like recursion also occurs in the real world. So if I took another laptop and I put it facing the laptop that I'm looking at right now, the two webcams would basically look back into each other, like again and again and again and again. And you get this like repeating set of images on the Zoom window, where it almost looks like, you know, the window gets smaller and smaller until it's like, you're like, oh, wow, basically this thing's going to infinity or whatever. So in the software world, recursion is basically like the term for a block of code that can call itself. So in software, we've got these things called functions, which are basically just like They are blocks of code that do something. So if I wanted to say like, okay, in my program, I want to, when the user does something, I want to be able to change the color of the background of my mobile application or something like that, right? I might have a function that says change background color or something like that. So recursion is basically like, I mean, the color changing one is not the best example, but recursion is basically a block of code that continually calls itself. So, I mean, I guess if we went down that example, we could say, okay, so this thing says, okay, change the background color of the screen. And then within it, it could call it again and say, so, okay, we're going blue, then we're going red, then we're going yellow. And it could just continue doing that until we give it instructions to say like, stop that process. And so I try to make the analogy, or I try to make the connection to say like anxiety is similar to that in the sense that we run these blocks of code or these thought processes that they will run for as long as they want until we give them some condition that says you got to break out of this loop that you're in. Mm-hmm. So that, just one concrete example there, but it's like, we'll sit on the couch and be like, I've got an interview coming up tomorrow. I'm nervous about it. And I'm just sitting down thinking about how the interview is going to go. I mean, a lot of people would call this rumination, right? Where it's like you're trying to see yourself in the room and you're trying to say, oh, it's going to go well. I'm not going to be nervous, yada, yada, yada. And then an hour later, you're like, oh my goodness, I just tried to put myself in that situation for the last hour, thinking that it was going to benefit me. And I'm like in a cold sweat. I feel way worse than I did an hour earlier, right? And so it's like kind of getting that awareness to be able to say, I'm in one of those loops right now. And here's the condition that allows me to break out of it. Maybe I need to get up and do 20 jumping jacks. Maybe I need to do some deep breathing, something like that.
Yeah. I think of this a lot. Something I learned relatively recently within the past year for sure is like our window of tolerance is like when you're normal, like you can think critically, logically, things make sense. You're not overthinking things. It's when you're like your best self. And then we go into these like hyper aroused states where we start thinking really anxiously. We get those anxious thoughts, that overthinking, those cognitive distortions, those loops, that rumination that you were talking about. And then sometimes we can go from that into like a shutdown state. And all of those occur, to me at least, with like almost like if this, then that type of programming in our brain, where like if this thing happens to you that triggers a trauma response, then that. And then that trauma response is for you to react a certain way or think a certain way. And it just kind of like boils over and over and over until you either get a code to stop, which for me, I need to like move in a certain way. I need to that's why exercise is so great. Like I need to do something to get myself out of a hyper aroused state, to get myself out of basically like shock my body into like regaining control of it. But the awareness part that you mentioned, like, dude, that's the hardest part. So I think
it definitely is.
A lot of people don't even know, like we've all talked about this, like a lot of us, we all didn't know that we had anxiety at some point in our life. So I think the most important question a lot of people might be asking is like, do I have anxiety? How do I know? So like, what is anxiety? What are like different types of anxiety? How do we create awareness around that first?
Yeah, I think the most basic definition that we can give is that anxiety is future-oriented fear. So if you go on Wikipedia, like I think the page for fear says like, or anxiety says, anxiety is not fear. Like it literally says that in the page. But I mean, it's kind of semantics, right? Where it's like, there is this spectrum of like, okay, I'm standing in front of a lion and I am afraid right now because I don't know what's going to happen with this altercation that's in front of me, right? But I guess if we pull ourselves back, 2,000 feet and we see a lion way off in the distance, like we're still afraid, even though, the moment of us interacting with the lion is however many feet, however many seconds away, right? So as we start to zoom out, we go from fear to anxiety. So anxiety being the fact that like, if we want a true definition or if we want to kind of set some sort of line in the sand is basically like, there isn't necessarily a true threat in front of us at the moment. And that is what separates fear from anxiety. And then if we talk about like, okay, if someone says, do I deal with anxiety? I've been thinking about that or whatever. I think the main thing is, right, like a lot of these things, a lot of conditions in the mental health world come down to sort of the word debilitation, or do they get in the way of healthy functioning, living a normal life? I think that everybody gets nervous from time to time, right? If you didn't, you'd probably be dead or a robot. So it's like, okay, on somebody's wedding day, if that person is nervous, that is totally reasonable. It is a huge monumental day. It's really important to that person. There's all these people watching them. They want it to go well, whatever. Does that necessarily mean that that person who got nervous on that day experiences anxiety? I don't think we can say for sure. We need to go and see, how do they live the rest of their life? What are some of their thought patterns? What are their common emotions? And then also like emotionally, like where does that person go to live? Right. I think that, just from my own experience, I felt as though like early on, probably in high school and college, I spent so much time thinking about what could go wrong with all these different situations and scenarios in my life, right? Like, okay, I'm seeing this girl. I want it to go well. What if she doesn't like me? What if she starts dating somebody else? Like I hate to admit it, but I don't mind admitting it. I guess it stinks that I had to go through it, but it's like, I spent so much of college. I would say 90% of college, like deep in the bowels of my mind. And I enjoyed college, but at the same time, I look back and I'm like, it was just painful because I didn't have the tools, right? It's like, I didn't know that I could stop these thought patterns, or that I should, or that there were tools out there that could facilitate that process a little bit more easily. And then if I fast forward to today, it's like, yes, do I still get anxious about certain things? I do. Do I still get nervous about certain things? I certainly do. But do I spend 90% of my time thinking that way? I do not. And a lot of that is that awareness and having, what I would call kind of like my anxiety toolkit, knowing that when I feel a certain way, I can do certain things. That's kind of going back to that if else statement, right? Or if this, then that. And so I think it's a gray area, or it's a spectrum at the very least, where it's like, if somebody is to say, am I an anxious person? Do I suffer from anxiety? It's like, well, we kind of have to make a determination at some point as to, do you have these feelings a decent amount of time? Do those feelings then hold you back from living the kind of life that you have envisioned for yourself? So it's not a super clear, clean cut answer, but that's the thought process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't think, well, I do think it's challenging to come up with like very clear cut lines, because like you said, everything's on a spectrum. What I think is super helpful, that it's been helpful for me, I know it's been helpful for Travis, and I think something that I kind of was lacking in my earlier years that I think would have been really helpful is like you said, I didn't have a toolkit. Like I didn't have an understanding that I could stop those thoughts, that I could, have more control over my anxiety and depression more than just a pill, which I hated when I was younger. I didn't really understand the concept of the toolkit. So you've mentioned this a few times, and I'm curious, what are like, if we can cover like 3 to 5 of your favorite tools that you use to recognize those thoughts and then break that, like the connection, break that rumination, or however you described it before.
Yeah. I think the tools, the tricky part is that the tools that I lay out come after the awareness, and the awareness is the hardest part. And there's almost like, there's nothing that I can really say to somebody to be like, hey, here's how you get the awareness, right? It's more, it's for lack of a better analogy, it's kind of like going to the gym, right? It's building this muscle of saying, I can identify, I am getting better at identifying when I am in my head, when I am in my subconscious mind, when I'm running these thought patterns. And again, that awareness is so difficult, but I think the trickiest part about it is the fact that sometimes it starts subconsciously. We kind of talked about that a little bit at the beginning of the episode, where we're living our lives, we're having a normal day, and then the bottom of our mind, some thought pops up and we don't even totally realize it, right? And then I guess our trigger or whatever it may be, we go into these thought processes without making the conscious decision to do so. And then at some point we begin doing it consciously, doing it as in running those thought patterns, perpetuating them consciously. Yeah. And so it is really difficult. And I guess if I had better ideas on getting that awareness, I would definitely share them. But that is, unfortunately, that is a big part of the battle. And it's kind of like, there's no other way to do it than just to catch yourself falling into these patterns time and time again. Right. Mm-hmm. I guess the best tool that I can think of off the top of my head that would help you build that awareness would be a meditation practice, right? Where it's like you're sitting down and you're methodically saying to yourself, I'm going to try to clear all the thoughts out of my mind. even if I don't necessarily clear them out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit here and I'm just going to be with my thoughts. I'm not going to attach to them. So the goal of meditation, right, is to sort of empty your mind in a way, but you know that the mind is one, especially an untrained mind. And I don't say that disparagingly. It's like, I meditate a little bit and I mean, my mind is constantly running. Most people's minds are, right. But sitting down and being able to say to ourselves, like, even though my mind is running right now or racing or however we want to phrase it, I'm just going to see the thought that pops into it and I'm going to wish it on its way, right? I'm not going to connect to it. I'm not going to attach to it. I'm just going to let it go. And as we sit there, that's sort of like meditation, sitting down and being with our thoughts is a little bit of like going to the gym, but for our mind. So we're building that awareness muscle and we're able to say like, okay, I spent 40 minutes this week, or I spent an hour yesterday or whatever, sitting down and trying to see the thoughts fall into my mind. That allows me the next time that I'm in the real world or I'm in a situation that makes me anxious, I can have some of that awareness because I'm practicing that on a daily basis.
I heard on the like meditation side, I heard a really good practice to like help with that, which is, and I'm curious to see if like you have any that you like as well. But basically like you sit, get quiet. And when you do that, you're going to have kind of like a constant like stream of thoughts coming up. And so the idea is like to visualize an actual stream, a river, and try to like hear the river, hear the stream moving. And then every time you have a thought, see that thought and put it like in a basket and put that basket in the stream and watch it float away.
Like that. I like that.
That's like worked really well for me. Cause it's like, almost like the episode that we had, which isn't out yet. It's coming out soon with Howard, where he talks about like, you can remember things quickly if you assign different things to them. So it's like 4 is car because there's 4 tires on you know what I'm saying? Like you can assign numbers to words. So remember things more quickly. It's almost kind of like that where your thoughts, instead of just having them bombard you, you assign them to an actual physical thing. And then you put that in everyone did that when they were a kid. They threw stuff in the river and watched it float away. So you can kind of like visualize that really well. And that kind of helps you get in a good like rhythm, I think. Do you have anything kind of like that you like to do? Any like practices to help get in the zone, basically?
I don't have too many particular ones. I will say I like that one a lot. I also, just from a like zooming out kind of high level standpoint, I think that whatever works for a particular person, it's great. And I'm not going to question it or anything like that. If somebody says, hey, this is what I do during meditation and it's effective for me, that's awesome. Like that's kind of the end of the discussion for me. Right. What I like to do, I have tried different mobile apps that, offer meditation. I have felt as though for me, the ones that have like guided meditations with voices and whatnot, the voices to me are a little distracting where they get me thinking again. And so I have found that just sitting down, maybe some white noise or something like that playing, maybe, but nothing that like actually makes me think or kind of kicks in my cognitive capacities again. So just sitting down quietly and trying to, again, let thoughts come into my mind and not attach to them. But I definitely want to give that one a try. The one with the river, yeah. That's definitely pretty cool. And I guess just from, we going into the idea of saying that if something works for someone, I'm good with it. Yeah. Like do what works for you. That's kind of the ethos of my brand. The first book is called Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety. And the reason why I call it a toolkit is in this book, I'm throwing a lot of different ideas at folks, right? So there may be 20 different strategies for not only escaping anxiety, but also kind of preventing yourself from falling into it in the first place. And I know that not every single one of those strategies is going to resonate with every single reader. So the idea is like, just as if we were talking about the meditation strategy, it's like, hey, if that one works for you, awesome. Grab that, put that in your toolkit. If deep breathing works for you, same thing, grab that, put that in the toolkit. And then what we want to do is like the goal of, a lot of the practices that my teachings and whatnot is basically to say to readers like, hey, we're all different. Everything works, every single strategy works for certain people, but not for other people. And so all we want to do is we want to get to the end of the content, or we want to go through this journey and we want to say, here are the 5 most effective things that work for me personally. And they might not necessarily work for you, but like, these are the ones that I'm going to pull out the next time that I feel anxious. And so I want all my readers and listeners to do that. because it's, the goal is for them to feel better. And I don't care. Like if they took one of my strategies, that's awesome. If they took somebody else's, that's amazing too. I just want to help them feel better and facilitate that journey. So to me, the specificities of how that happens, it doesn't matter so much.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. It reminds me of like getting people to execute a movement pattern as like a fitness coach. I'm thinking about getting people to execute a movement pattern. Every fitness coach has cues that work really well, and sometimes on a squat, we want people to drive their feet into the ground, almost like they're screwing their feet in the ground. Sometimes we want them to pull the bar really hard down on their back when they're deadlifting. Sometimes we want them to activate their lats. And there's a whole bunch of different ways that we get that to happen. And over the course of many years, we figured out which ones work best. So I know when I want you to activate your glutes on your hip thrust, this sounds crazy, but a lot of times it works. Imagine you have a bowl of soup in your lap and you're trying to pour it into your belly button. I want you to activate your lats on your deadlift. I want you to imagine that you have newspapers in your armpits. You're trying to hold them there really tight. And so there's like similar things. It's like, if this version of meditation works for you, if deep breathing works for you, whatever tempo you use on your breathing, if that works for you, like try a bunch of things, find what works well for you, or even just listen to a bunch of options and I think that one's going to work really well for me. I know, like listening to what Travis just said about putting thoughts into a river and letting them float away, I know that will work really well for me. I've never tried it before, but I know it'll work really well for me just because of all the other things I've tried. So I think like trial and error is quite a big part of it, but also like learn from someone like you, who, much like me in my fitness scenario here, like I know what cues are most likely to work most of the time. Which forms of meditation or which tools of this toolkit are most likely to work most of the time. We're still going to talk about a lot of them. So I love meditation as one of them. What are some other things that you tend to utilize in your own practice?
Yeah. So I guess the question itself warrants me talking about the framework of the book.
Yes.
So
yes.
The book itself, the first book, and I have a second book, but that one's on depression. I think that's probably for another day, just given the time and how far we've gone into anxiety thus far. But so the first book is broken into, it's two parts. So it's like zooming in and then zooming out is what I call them. And so zooming in is taking a look at acutely anxious situations. So we are already nervous, right? We are already anxious. How do we walk ourselves back from those feelings of fear? And then the second half of the book is zooming out and basically saying, how do we live a life with less anxiety in it overall? Maybe to put it another way, how do we get into anxiety less often? And so in the first part of the book, I have this framework called the 10 steps to getting out of your head. And those are 10 tools that people can employ if they want to, again, walk that fear back in the heat of the moment. In the book, I kind of lay it out as in like, hey, run through each of the 10 steps sequentially, but it definitely doesn't need to happen like that. I think you can also just take the ones that work for you and applies those at the right time. So if you wanted to, we could jump into some of those right now. The second half of the book is a little more high level. So I think it might be more effective, more tactical to jump into the 10 steps to getting out of your head.
I would love it, man. Let's do it.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So why don't I do this? I'm going to read off 1 through 5 and I'm going to say, you guys tell me which one you want to go deeper on.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So the first one is to breathe. That's super simple. There's some science behind it. We could talk about it if you want, but that's the first one. It's pretty easy. Second one, determine the true importance of what's making you anxious. Number 3, evaluate the potential outcomes. So this is like in regards to like a specific situation that you're in, right? So like for example, I'm about to go to a job interview and I'm nervous about it. So think of it from that frame. Say, evaluate the potential outcomes and reconnect to the one you want. Number 4 is shift your focus to something positive. And number 5 is recite a powerful mantra. I do want to, I can't really preface because I already said 1 through 5, but I do want to say that some of these are simple, right? And I think if all we do is recite them and say, hey, those are the 5 of them, like I run the risk of sounding hilariously obvious. Somebody being like, yeah, dude, like shift your focus to something positive. Like, yeah, I've known that my whole life. I'm not
Stop
an idiot.
Thinking about it.
Yeah. And some of the reason why I tell my own stories in the books is because it's the application of simple ideas to things to situations in our own lives that helps them stick. I think a lot of people, like I've worked with different life coaches over the course of my own life. And they will sometimes say that like, the reason why you having a coach will be beneficial is that you are too close to the problem. Mm-hmm. I can zoom out. I can look at the battle that you're facing right now from a different angle, right? And so some of this whole process is that where I can say to somebody, yeah, I mean, if all I said to you was shift your focus to something positive, or somebody said that to themselves, they'd be like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, right? This is so obvious. But when I then tell the stories and relate them to things that I've gone through, that person can then say, oh, I see how that, relates to the things that I'm dealing with right now. And obviously, I mean, I get a little bit deeper, I get a little bit more detailed than necessarily just that high level. And again, the step itself, just the words can seem unhelpful on the surface.
Yeah. We see that all the time. And we've had people come on the podcast and for example, talk about breathing. People don't breathe right. Like, and when you're anxious, when I'm anxious, when I'm really anxious, cause I'm not breathing, or I am breathing and it's really shallow and it's from my chest.
Yeah. And that makes it worse.
It makes it way worse. But and a lot of people will breathe in that situation and they're like, and their chest rises all the way up. And it's like, they're breathing still from their chest. They're not breathing diaphragmatically. So although that sounds simple, it is not as simple as it sounds. There's a practice.
Still doing it wrong.
You're still doing it wrong.
You're still doing it wrong.
Yeah, it's simple. It's not easy. But
absolutely.
Of those 5, I don't know about you, Travis. Maybe we can each pick a couple. I'm thinking 2 and 4, like the importance part and the shifting focus part.
Because that's exactly what I was thinking too.
That's what I struggle with. Like those 2 things for sure are what I struggle with the most.
I'm also
does this even matter? And then trying to not think of a red car.
Yeah.
Don't think of a red car and you're like, there's fucking red cars everywhere, dude.
Yeah. I'm also curious about number 2 also, because my anxiety is very specific. There's a lot of things that give people anxiety that I don't get anxiety about. But Same. The things that do cause me anxiety, I feel like it's kind of all the time. So that's always something that I've been curious about. To what we talked about in the very beginning. I literally didn't have anxiety until after school, basically. There's nothing about the process and the lifestyle of being in school. I realized how relaxed I was because I just didn't give a fuck about any of it. I never ever cared about school or thought that it was important. And you know what I'm saying? I was I could get C's and B's, but the whole lifestyle around going to school was very relaxing for me because I think weighing the importance, I think that's really what causes my anxiety. It's not like I have anxiety about everything. It's there are certain things that really give me a lot of anxiety. So it's kind of interesting to think about, why is that?
For sure. Yeah. You guys want to jump on in? We can do 2 and 4.
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool. So let me just repeat. Number 2 is determine the true importance of what's making you anxious. So there's a million different ways that I could jump into this one. I think one that is still relevant and timely, even though I'm going to be a little nuanced. I'm going to be careful with it. So I actually wrote a blog post about this at the beginning of COVID. And I said, so I would say in March of 2020, we didn't know what the virus was like. We didn't know what the numbers were like. We didn't know how it spread, how it affected people and whatnot, right? But then we fast forward a couple months later and we had more statistics around hey, here is, here's the segment of the population that is more affected by this disease. This is the, if you get it, the likelihood of a bad outcome or something like that. And I found, amongst my social circles, friends, family, and then also on the news, which is another place that anxiety pops in. Right. But it's there were folks that I talked to who, and why I say I'm going to be nuanced is I am definitely I'm definitely on the side of look, we got to protect each other. We got to take care of each other. This was a deadly virus and we want to make sure that we're careful. But at the same time, this was not Ebola, right? This was not you get it 50% chance that you're dead. And so a lot of us, we watched the news early on in COVID and we said to ourselves, hey, if I step outside, we got so scared of what we were dealing with that it was if we step outside, somebody could have walked down the street and coughed and I could get COVID and then I could just drop dead like on the sidewalk. Right. And again, I'm trying to be a little bit careful, a little bit cautious, because it's a deadly disease, and a lot of folks have been affected by it, and I want to be cognizant of that. But I think at the same time, right, we can say that like there is such thing as looking at numbers and saying like, hey, this is how many people are affected by it. This is how people spread the disease. This is the percentage likelihood of a bad outcome or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And then kind of look at what we're thinking about at the moment and say, the thought patterns that I'm running don't necessarily correlate with those actual facts. And the problem with anxiety is that when we get inside of our heads, again, I'm trying to be cautious. I don't want to sound like I'm being dismissive or anything like that, but we do sometimes tend to blow things out of proportion, right? So I talked to some friends who are like, look, I'm not going to leave my house for 6 months. Like, I don't want to die, like all this. And it's like, look, I think we should all be careful and we should follow the rules and we should, pay attention and whatnot. But if we actually look at the statistics and we say, this is what is happening, that doesn't necessarily warrant what our fear response is. And so it's like, when I say, determine the true importance of what's making you anxious, it's being able to say like, okay, I realize I have the awareness that I just ruminated over what could go wrong with COVID or something else. It could be a job interview. It could be a first date. It could be skydiving, right? It's like, I'm taking this situation and almost like detaching from it in a bad way, in the sense of like, I'm going to this place in my mind where I'm making this thing out to be so much worse than it actually is. And again, I want to step back and say COVID was bad. And I'm not trying to say it wasn't bad. What I am trying to say is, I don't know if it really ever warranted saying like, hey, if I step outside of my house, I'm going to drop dead on the sidewalk, right? And so being able to take that step back and say, look, okay, maybe I need to do a little research. Maybe I need to see what the numbers are. Maybe I need to reconnect to those numbers. That's an important step. And I guess because COVID is controversial, why don't we maybe just like real quick, talking about a job interview or something like that, right? It's like we go into these thought spirals of saying, okay, this job interview is the only thing that's important to me in my life, right? And if I don't get the job, I'm going to basically be dead. Like I'll have no reason to live anymore. I don't like my current job. I'll be totally depressed, whatever it is. And I think that when the problem, again, we kind of extrapolate some of the things that we go through. And it's, again, I'm not trying to like be dismissive or anything like that. But I think if we step back and we say, look, this job interview, it is important to me. But I also know that if I don't get it, like life continues, right? I will figure a way out. And so getting back to that sort of awareness is really important, and being able to say like, okay, how important is this in my life, and how is it affecting me? And is what I'm doing as a result of what I think that is that commensurate with the source of the anxiety itself? Am I explaining myself right?
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that's such a good point. Like that is, I think what a lot of people don't understand, and, like a lot of what you're being affected by is literally just the anxiety. It's not the thing that you're worried about. Mm-hmm. Like, and that is a like a really important thing to understand and focus on. The job interview example is great. That's something that's always given me a ton of anxiety. And for whatever reason, but yeah, it's good to kind of take a step back and realize like, what happens if I go into this job interview and they're like, you're a pathetic loser. You could never work here. Get the fuck out of here. You know what I mean? Worst case scenario. What's going to happen? I go home and then I'll just like get another job interview. But like the thought of going to like a job interview, might give somebody like the amount of anxiety, like they're playing like a game of Russian roulette or something. You know what I'm saying? Like it's that feeling like so I think that's a great point. Like that's really not, we're assigning like a fear to something that really isn't it. The punishment doesn't fit the crime, basically.
Yeah. And it happens subconsciously, right? Where it's like, we're not sitting down and being like, I'm willingly saying that this job interview is the most important thing of all time. It just happens, right? Subconsciously, we run these thought patterns that we look back and then all of a sudden we're like, no, this really is such a big deal. And again, not to be dismissive. That's kind of the theme here. It's like, it's not even to say like, hey, that job interview isn't important to you. It's just that most of the time, it's not that do or die scenario that maybe your anxiety is telling you that it is.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking back a lot to an episode that we had with a gentleman named Jay Thuft, who was talking about like the identity that we believe we have to these certain things. And that causes a lot of the anxiety where it's like, oh, if I don't get this job, like what are my friends and my family going to think of me? Like what's going to happen in my relationship, my finances, like all of these things. And you kind of like center your identity around your ability to do this one thing, when a lot of what you guys are talking about is like, dude, it's not the worst thing if it doesn't happen. Like you're still all of these other things. Like your identity is still composed of all of these other things. And this is just one situation and one job or one social encounter or one interaction that like, if it doesn't go the way that you expect it to or want it to, like that doesn't change who you are. Like it doesn't change your ability to do that thing. It's a rep. It's an at bat. That's all it is. And people strike out. And that's kind of part of the game. Like you strike out every now and then, you learn what you could improve upon. And also you learn that like, you're pretty fucking resilient.
Absolutely. I think that's a huge thing is, people say like fail often, fail fast, that sort of thing. And it's like, everybody is afraid of failure, right? I am too. But most of the time, those big failures that we had been worried about our entire lives and we had resisted and pushed off, when they come, we figure it out, right? And we figure out that we are resilient.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And you do that, you realize that like you're capable. And when you realize you're capable, it does help you feel more confident going into those scenarios where you're like, I've been here before, I've fucked up a lot, but I've also done really well a lot. And so I know I'm capable of this. So I am confident. And I think that's a huge help. But it comes down to like what you were talking about, the importance of that thing, how much it resonates with your identity, and like making peace with that, and like making peace with all of the situations that could happen, and whether or not it does go wrong. Something that I as we're, got like 10, 15 minutes left here, I really want to shift and learn more about like shifting focus and shifting your thought patterns. Because, we're talking about one, becoming aware, we're breathing, we're aware of our distorted thoughts and where they're going and what they're doing. But then like, how do we not do that?
How do we not?
You ever want to just not?
Can you just not?
So that's the hard part. Like once we recognize and become aware of this thought process and aware of this pattern, that's what it is. It's a pattern. How do we interrupt it? How do we shift our focus?
Yeah. I mean, so these 10 different steps that I walk through, right? I think the one that we just went through is a little bit, it's a slightly more involved process where we're doing some thinking, right? But if we go to some of the quick hitters, when we say like, okay, breathe, right? Develop some sort of breathing pattern, whether it's like box breathing or, just deep breathing in general. It's like, okay, we're building up this toolkit. We're saying, okay, breathing is a good one. Let's use a mantra. Let's listen to one of our favorite songs. Let's go for a walk, whatever it is. We can then have all these tools at our disposal that we can pull out once we've had that awareness. And we can say to ourselves, like, I know I need to not, or I need to stop it. Right. And here are some of the things that I can pull out of my toolkit to help me do that. So there are a lot of different tools of that nature. Right. And again, some of them are in this 10-step list, and some of them I just talk about off the cuff in the books, but it's sort of just that process of, digesting as much information as you can, whether it's my book, maybe some other books, some podcasts or something like that. And just getting in the mindset of being able to say, okay, that is something that sounds good to me, right? Josh, when you said, I've never even used the meditation, the river basket thing, but I know it's going to work, right? It's that same sort of mental process where you say, I heard an idea, and just knowing who I am on a personality level, like I know that resonates with me. So I'm just going to write it down right now. I'm going to add that to my toolkit. And then, obviously we change, we grow and whatnot. And so it's like, maybe we start with 10 different ideas. And then over time we say, oh, idea number 8 doesn't sit so well with me anymore, but I heard this other one, let me throw that in there. And it doesn't really matter how many, like the sheer number of tactics that we have isn't all that important. It's just kind of like, if you find yourself in different situations and you think that some of those strategies work better in certain situations than others, then you're going to want a few more, right? Yeah,
dude, I think of it like a golf bag. Right? Like I've got my driver, I've got my 9-iron, I've got my 7. Like I have different strategies for different things. And so I guess to give listeners like an example, we've been talking about creating awareness, and that's challenging to do. It's really challenging to do. And I believe that like some sort of external therapy is incredibly helpful to be able to do that. And so like being very candid, something that I've learned is that a lot of my negative reactions to certain situations come from trauma that I endured as a child, like when I was like 15 years old. And so I've learned through therapy, through psychedelic therapy and whatnot, to be able to identify that version of me that's being stimulated, that's responding. And so I'm aware of the situations that part of me comes out in. I'm aware that is quite literally like my 15-year-old self and the trauma that I endured at that age. And I'm aware of where I feel that in my body and like what it feels like. So I know that I feel tension in the center of my chest, right where my sternum is. I can touch it. That is where I feel it. And so when I start to, one, recognize and become aware of a situation where that may occur and that may come out. Two, I recognize and am aware of the sensation that I feel in my body. Then I can be aware of, this is a loop. This is a pattern. This is my 15-year-old self responding. I need to make sure that part of me is okay. And I'm not going to respond the way that part of me would, that person would, my 15-year-old self, but I'm going to pull myself back, think logically. And usually like the toolkit there is like, understand where it is, feel my chest, take 3 seconds to go breathe, remind myself it's okay, and come back. And that's like, dude, to be honest, that's been my driver lately. Like I feel that, I use it all the time and I'm very aware of it, but it took a lot, and it took a lot of therapy too, to be able to become aware of situations that trigger that response. And also number one, and number two, what I notice inside my body in like response to that. And for me, one of the easiest things one of the things that's worked best for me in creating that awareness is like feeling those sensations in my body. So like, I know where my anxiety lives in my body. I know where my stress and my depression lives. I know where sadness and joy and all these different emotions, like they have a feeling, they reside somewhere inside me. And like, that's my awareness. Like I feel those things and that helps me become aware. Otherwise I would have no fucking idea.
Well, just like Brian said earlier, the awareness is like the hardest and most important part, basically. Mm-hmm. It's hard to deal with something if, you don't have the awareness of even what's going on.
Yeah. So strategies to become aware and also the tools to overcome that when you do become aware of it. I think honestly, like probably a lot like your book, I think the best way to do that is just to like talk to people. And this is the thing is like, people don't talk about this enough. So I'm very open about it because I know that somebody listening is going to be like, oh, wow, like that might work for me. Kind of like the meditation practice that Travis said, like, we don't know unless we hear something that resonates with us. So your book is likely full of all of these different ideas and options and opportunities where as you're reading through it, I'm like, okay, so that might not work for me, but this one will. And I know that. And I think that being like just exposing each other to different tools, different possibilities, that's where this starts. Because otherwise we don't know it exists.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you touched upon a ton of great things there. I would say, like, I'm very happy to hear that about your journey and the fact that you've made that progress. I mean, that story was awesome. Like the fact that you have gotten to that point where you know where your feelings live and you can disconnect from past traumas. Like that's amazing.
Thank you, man.
I would say, I don't know of too many people that have gotten to that point. So you should be very proud of yourself.
Thank you.
The other thing too was like, again, going back to one of the episodes of your show that I was listening to, I think it was a couple of weeks ago. There was the doctor who was talking about ketamine and psychedelic treatments and whatnot. And so he was saying, the person is 80% of the experience and the set and setting too. But then like the drug itself is 20%. And I think the same idea applies to this content, right? Where it's like, sure, I wrote this book and I hope it helps people and whatnot, but like, I didn't do anything. I basically put these words in front of people. And then based on all the things that they've gone through in their lives, some of my words are either going to, I don't know if trigger is the right word, but kind of get them thinking in a certain way, right? And be able to relate to their own experiences. And then from there, make sense of those experiences. They have to ultimately do that, even though my words may assist or facilitate in that process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, exposing to people to different ideas, and then, it is up to them. It resonates. And, we realize that that's something that might be helpful for me, just like Travis's meditation analogy. It's resonated with me. I know it's going to work. I just have to do it. Like that's really the hard part, is I just have to do it. So if you're struggling, if you think that you might be an anxious person or have anxious tendencies, is how I'd rather refer to it to, then like have a discussion, talk to people, find people with resources, people like Brian who are talking about this stuff, who are sharing ideas, things that work for them, things that work for people that we know, and pick out a few things that would work for you. And it doesn't have to be excessive. It doesn't have to be meditating for 10 minutes a day. It can be something as simple as what we've talked on this podcast a lot, is like writing down 3 things you're grateful for every day. Like very simple strategies to keep your mind in a positive space, but it just comes down to sharing those. So Brian, you've shared a lot of those, and I do really, really appreciate it, man. I know a lot of people are going to want to, 1, follow you, 2, know where your books are available and where they can learn more about you. So, as we're wrapping up here, I'd love to give you the opportunity to kind of give yourself the plug and let people know where they can find you.
Cool. Yeah. Easiest place to find me is my website. So that's getoutofyourhead.com. There's no dashes or spaces or anything in there. On social media, I mostly just post on Instagram, to be honest. See what happens. Maybe I'll expand that in the future, but it's just a lot of work, right? With the books and the blog and podcasts and stuff like that. So on Instagram, the current handle is Get Out of Your Head Books. That's all one word as well. I will say that what's today? February 21st. I have a trademark application, which is processing at the minute or at the moment. So when that finalizes, I may be able to get the handle Get Out of Your Head. So if you're listening to this episode a few months from now or a year from now or whatever, I guess just check both places. And that's kind of it. I guess, I always kind of leave folks with the message of just saying that if you're going through something, if you're struggling, like, please reach out to me, please reach out to someone that, like, don't feel like you're alone, because you're definitely not, right? Like the 3 of us, we're having this conversation. You guys have been awesome to talk about your past experiences, right? I think these podcasts, this medium in general, it's been amazing that it's gotten a lot of traction in the last few years, because it's such a needed kind of medium, right? Where folks are just talking openly about different things that they've been through. I think we're able to get some of those strategies out there. We're able to get some of those stories out there and help people feel like they're not as alone. So to anyone who's listening, like if you feel as though you have a short story to share, or you want to talk to somebody about some of the experiences you've been through, I'd be happy to have a conversation with you. Please reach out to me on social media. And then also, like, at the same time, like, don't feel as though you can't reach out to a professional as well, right? Like I consider myself a sufferer and a journalist. If you want to reach out to a doctor, a medical professional, please do that as well. There's all sorts of things that you can combine in your healing journey. It doesn't necessarily have to be just one book, just one medication, whatever it is. I guess if we're zooming up and we're talking about the toolkit, right? The toolkit is not necessarily just things that we say to ourselves. It's also actions, behaviors, maybe medication, maybe exercise. Like you're trying to find the things that work for you and like twist those knobs and those levers and whatnot, and just get yourself to that point where you feel as though you've got a well-oiled machine. So
I love that. And I think that's a really important note to end on is, if you're feeling something and you want to talk about it, dude, talk about it. It's 2022, dude. Guys can talk about this shit. Okay. Like done with the fucking man up bullshit. Like if you're anxious or you have anxious tendencies, or you're feeling sad or depressed, dude, talk about it. One of my favorite things is when people reach out to us from the episodes and they're like, dude, oh my God, like what you said really resonated with me. Tell a story. That's one of my favorite things in the world.
That's awesome.
And I know we all feel that way. So like, if you're listening to this and you have something to say, or you have something to share, you want to say hi and let us know how you feel or how it made you feel, if it was helpful or not, dude, reach out to us. We want to hear this. And, like Brian said, this is a small part of the journey. Like if therapy is helpful, like we may have some contacts for that. Like everyone who has a great therapist is so excited to share their therapist with someone. Like I love when people are like, hey, do you have a good contact for me? I'm like, fuck yeah, dude, you need the person I work with. So we're all in this together. We're all willing to help. You're absolutely not alone. So yeah, reach out to us. Use us as a resource. Give Brian a follow. Go to his website, getoutofyourhead.com. Like visit his Instagram. Like let's all connect. Let's all be better together. And I think we'll be able to make a big impact that way. So Brian, I really appreciate you coming on, man. It's been a great conversation of a topic that deserves a lot of attention. So I appreciate you giving it to us.
For sure. Thanks for having me. And I guess my last thing is, for folks who are listening, where it's like, oh, like, I don't know, like the whole man up thing or whatever. It's like, Josh is a literal bodybuilder. So if he's talking about this stuff, like it is okay to talk about. So awesome conversation. And thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it. And thank you all for tuning into another episode of the Struggle to Strength podcast. We will see y'all next week.